So today we're going to investigate culture, and we're going to specifically focus on two types of culture: folk versus popular culture, also known as pop culture. So first of all, let's review the definition of culture and how it applies to folk versus pop. So one definition of culture is it's a body of material traits, customary beliefs, social forms that together create a tradition of a group of people. A lot of times you see culture mixed with the word tradition. Let's break that down just a little bit. So there's two key elements to culture. One are material goods. These are the things that we keep, we buy, we take care of. And then things that we believe, such as language, religion, and ethnicity. So the first thing we're going to focus on is the first part, which is material goods. And these are the visible elements that we possess, so things that we hold on to, physical things we hold on to, or leave behind for the future. So let's go ahead and define folk versus pop. So folk culture is practiced by a small group of people, and there's this word homogeneous. Homogeneous groups mean groups that are similar together. So this is where a group of people who have a lot in common, and they typically live in isolated rural areas. Whereas pop culture is practiced by a large group of people who are, it's a word called heterogeneous. These are people who are not like each other. They have a lot of differences with each other, yet despite that, they connect with this culture bit. So I love the picture on the bottom right, the Gangnam Style. Okay, this was formed in Japan. Obviously not the similar culture as the US, but yet people in the US still connected with it. So let's go ahead and compare how these two types of cultures begin. And the word that is used with that is origination. Where do they originate from? So folk culture usually has unknown hearth. We talked about this word hearth earlier, where hearth is a starting place for an idea or a good. And so for folk culture, they have been around for so long that most of the time people don't know when they have started. And sometimes it can occur in multiple places, isolated from each other, so they don't necessarily interact with each other. But for example, like the idea of reading. There were several places on the earth where reading began, this whole idea of writing down our language and then reading the language. It occurred multiple places, but no one said this was the person who started reading. But pop culture is produced in developed countries, so you automatically have an idea where it begins, and usually it's traceable to a very specific person or a corporation in a particular place. For example, think about the phrase, "just do it," which is a Nike phrase. You can attribute that idea to a company that originated that idea. So how are they spread? So folk typically is transmitted physically with people. And so they are transmitted from one location to another. And because it's through people that the idea is coming across, it's very slowly, on a much lower scale. So I love this diagram right here where you see the idea has to overcome a physical barrier. So it's going to take a little bit longer, and then they take that with them. So we talked about ways of diffusion. This is by relocation diffusion. People take it and move it with them. Popular, on the other hand, follows hierarchical diffusion, where you have a person or a group of people in power, and they then spread it downward. And because it's by a person in power or influence, it occurs very, very rapidly, and it is very extensive. So, for example, something may occur through the internet. It's going to spread very rapidly, or it's going to be shown on television. It's going to be spread very rapidly. So let's now look at how it is distributed, where the word distributed means spread out. So folk, when it is being spread out, is very much influenced by physical and cultural factors. Physical factors mean if you are a village living in the mountains and you've got to get past the mountains to spread that idea, it's going to affect it. It's going to be a pretty small area. Or cultural factors is this is usually something practiced by a group that is the same. So if you go to another culture group, they probably will not adopt that folk culture, which means it's not going to spread there. Pop culture, on the other hand, goes across all barriers, physical, cultural, and so those don't influence it as much. And so because the technology often is not influenced by the barriers. For example, a TV signal can go from the west coast to the east coast very quickly, even though it's a large space. You've got several mountain ranges in the way. It doesn't matter. So let's also investigate how people spend their time. Leisure activities, what we spend our time doing. So for example, music. Folk music, this is not music you're going to hear on the radio. This is music that is passed down from generation to generation. And typically they tell a story or they convey some type of life cycle event. Such they talk about birth or they talk about death, they talk about marriage or the environment, especially really big in communities where they are farmers. Pop culture, music is written for a different purpose. It's not telling you about events, it is being produced to be sold or to be performed for completely entertainment value. There is no real focus on those lyrics except to make money. Now in the past, musicians usually were clustered together. For example, country was focused in Nashville, Tennessee, or hip-hop was originated in Detroit. But today, because of technology, it's very spread out. And then music festivals where this music is promoted once again occurs in dominant developed countries, mostly Europe and the United States. Now if we were to look at sports, most sports actually started as folk culture, but there are a few that have overcome those cultural and physical barriers that have now become pop culture. For example, soccer. Soccer originated in the UK or England, United Kingdom, but because of its ability to spread, it was diffused by relocation, which is a folk characteristic, but it became so diffused that now it's worldwide. And so it's become that pop culture, even though it started as a folk culture. The World Cup is the most watched event in the world. Now, there are some folk sports that have survived but have remained folk because they really haven't taken on that worldwide characteristic. For example, cricket is a sport that is also practiced in the UK. You can see it right here. It has spread really only to one other country, which is India, and the reason it was spread was through relocation because Britain used to colonize India. An Asian culture called Wushu is also still practiced today, but once again not on a worldwide scale. Or baseball, originating in the United States, hasn't taken on that worldwide sphere. And the perfect example of that is the debate that is had whether or not baseball should be in the Olympics. The reason that people say no is because they say it's not a worldwide sport. And then finally in Australia is the game rugby, once again practiced on a small scale, not gaining that worldwide popularity. We're also going to look at material possessions because that is influenced by culture as well. Things like clothing, food, or housing. So clothing, folk is influenced by the environment. Typically people wear what is good for the environment. So if you think about the Eskimo Indians and how they would wear clothing made out of whale skin, that's because that's what they had access to. But then if you go to Polynesia, which is in the tropical islands, you could see they wear very different clothing because they are influenced by a different environment. Religion can also influence what you wear, and tradition can also influence what you wear. Whereas pop culture is not influenced by that. You're going to see people wearing jeans, a pop culture clothing, in all parts of the world. Cold, hot, warm, doesn't matter. And it can also be influenced by an occupation. For example, if you see a doctor, you're probably going to see a doctor wearing scrubs across the board because that's influenced by occupation rather than the environment. Or income, where you may see that rich people may wear name brands. That is more influenced by their ability to buy the name brand than what is good for the environment or the religion or tradition. And then you can see conflict exists between those, and we'll investigate that a little bit further. Food can also be influenced. So once again, in folk, there's a word called terroir, and this is how the environment affects food. For example, in Italy, in northern Italy, they use a tomato-based sauce called marinara, which we know today as spaghetti sauce. In southern Italy, they use a white sauce known as an Alfredo sauce that's based more on cheese. And the reason for that is it is too warm in southern Italy to grow tomatoes. And so they're influenced by the environment on what they can access. Taboos are also people who refuse to eat particular plants because they feel it has a negative influence. So for example, the Jewish people of the Jewish culture refuse to eat pork because they believe it goes against their religion. It's a taboo. Whereas people in India, refuse to eat beef because they feel like the cow is a sacred animal and should not be taken in that manner. So folk is influenced by that. Pop is more influenced by culture than environment. Perfect example is McDonald's. People eat McDonald's across the board. Doesn't matter about those types of things. And then housing. In the past, they were influenced much by the environment, what they could access, what was available. So that's why a lot of houses are built with wood and brick, because that's what's available. But then you also see a culture influence of sacred space. And what that means is a place in the house that is very valuable. People spend the most time there. Now in the past, older homes were influenced more by folk, but today, newer houses are more influenced by pop culture because they are built by corporations that built what people prefer with their taste rather than what they can access in the resources.